75 years. 75 years ago, ladies and gentlemen, the world was reading in amazement of the Purge trials in Moscow, Stalin's attempt to rewrite history by eliminating those who made it, and millions more beside. There were no WikiLeaks, no CNN, no Twitter to expose that monstrous perversion of justice. Human rights had not entered the lexicon. It did some 3 years later with the first modern human rights convention drafted by a group of English writers led by H.G. Wells, J.B. Priestley, A.A. Milne motored up from Pooh Corner to add his bit to the draft. They eschewed the messianic preambles of the 18th century French and American conventions. They instead looked not to the law of nature or the grace of God, but rather to human dignity. Their convention began, since a man comes into this world through no fault of his own, he is in justice entitled, without distinction of race or color, to nourishment, housing, covering, medical care, and attention sufficient to realize his full possibilities of physical and mental development. That was the first right that those great writers devised. Of course, it went on in rather fine and dated style. There shall be no secret dossiers in any administrative department. A man's private home or apartment or reasonably limited garden enclosure is his castle. But this was turned into a book, a Penguin special, H.G. Wells on the Rights of Man. In 1940, it was the bestseller around the world. It seemed to offer hope against the Holocaust. The British War Office had it translated into German. They dropped hundreds of thousands of copies from Spitfires on the SS divisions as they were sweeping across France. They didn't stop to read it. But one of H.G. Wells' friends, President Roosevelt, did. And it inspired his Four Freedoms speech, his appeal for a post-war world formed upon four essential freedoms: freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, freedom from fear. Freedom from want and freedom from fear. Well, after the Holocaust, of course, came the Nuremberg trials, came eventually in 48, 49, that great human rights triptych of the Universal Declaration, the Geneva and the Genocide Conventions. 50 years onwards, we had all the good conventions, conventions against apartheid, against racism, against torture, conventions against the maltreatment of women and children and refugees. But of course, none of those conventions had enforcement mechanisms attached. As someone said, surveying the killing fields of Rwanda, the road to hell is paved with good conventions. But it was words, in other words, are not enough. The rules must be enforceable. We have, in some respects, come a long way. When I joined Amnesty back in 1974, it was basically an organization writing groveling letters to tyrants. My first job was to, I will never forget, write to Your Excellency Idi Amin Dada, VC, DSO, and VAR, DFC. I also wrote to General Pinochet, begging letters. 25 years later, we had him under house arrest, well, manor house arrest, in the UK. We now have Mladic and Karadzic in the dock. We have the verdict on Charles Taylor due in 2 weeks' time. We have Resolution 1970, a unanimous Security Council resolution referring the situation in Libya to the ICC. Approval of international justice at last. Those brave demonstrators who are today holding placards in Syria, they read, Al-Assad to The Hague. It's a pity he's not going there anytime soon, but his time will come. But we're not here to celebrate our successes in the last 75 years, but to look at some of our omissions, particularly Roosevelt's third and fourth freedoms. Has there been a failure of nerve, perhaps, in tackling religion and cultural dogmas that discriminate against women, undervalue gays? A failure of expertise, perhaps, or technique in dealing with the financial, for the organizations whose risk-laden policies the World Bank tells us threw 80 million more people into poverty last year. In our cautious way, we haven't even adopted democracy as a full-blooded human right. And this seems a good time to think about changes or repositioning the human rights movement. There is the acceptance of enforceability of certain human rights, at least, in Resolution 1970. There is the seeming delivery on Havel's power of the powerless in the streets of the Arab Spring. We have new tools and techniques which could add to, maybe supplant, our traditional legal armory. It may be time to think imaginatively about helping people in those countries where crime is so organized and so pervasive that it robs citizens of Roosevelt's fourth freedom. So, Diego Luna, how are things down south of the border, down Mexico way? Do your people have freedom from fear?
No. Fear is everywhere. Hi, everyone. We're living a war that the state is not willing to call a war. And it's quite a complex one, because you have first the natural one, which is the state fighting the drug cartels. But then you also have the drug cartels fighting each other. Then you also have a country where tourism has been affected, almost every industry. So you have plenty of people trying to survive, and that generates violence.
We have the country with the richest man in the world, Carlos
then you
Slim,
have,
and grinding poverty. Does that sap the resilience?
He claims to be the second richest guy in the world. And then you have more than half of the population in extreme poverty in the same country.
Does that sap their resilience to stand up to the drug cartels?
Well, it's a little more complicated than this, because it all ends up in the human drama of migration. Everyone wants to live. Everyone needs to live in order to survive, to find a better life. And there's two options today. Today there's an option of going either joining the cartels, which is in a month you have money, you have a gun, you have power, you have everything that the state is not giving you. You have a future, a short one probably, but at least a future.
Yeah.
So they change their lives in a second. And then you have the other ones that are willing to do a longer journey, which is trying to cross the border, also risking their lives.
And you're a filmmaker.
Yeah.
Are you making films about this to persuade the local people or to tell the world?
Yeah, definitely I'm making films about this, but the most important thing I do is we have a film festival, the documentary film festival. So we're choosing films and trying to show them in Mexico, but it's a festival that doesn't work for a city and, in the niche of the art world. What does, it travels around the country to 15 states and stays a week in your city and in the little villages, and we take films out in the plazas, and we even have a program that goes to prisons. And the idea is to confront people with someone else's reality. Many times about hearing a very specific and intimate story about someone else, you learn much more about who you are than even looking in a mirror.
Jeremy, you've got tools and techniques that aim to help people in this kind of situation. Can they do more than make films and tour film festivals?
I think the challenge is connecting film, which can be an incredibly powerful tool for emotional impact and for persuasion, with kind of long-term infrastructure and strategies for social change and for the mobilization of people. So it frustrates me sometimes when I see, on the one hand, you've got these amazing films that move people and take people to this extraordinary place where they're motivated to act, but there's nothing they can do. And it's not embedded within a more coherent social change strategy or a movement. So I think our challenge in the human rights space is actually to connect those efforts with those strategies in a much more systematic way than we've done. I think when we do that, we channel and harness and bottle that energy and turn it into power, which is what we need to do.
We saw the power of the powerless using those techniques in the Arab Spring, but in a sense, they were using it to rally the population against an army or an establishment that did actually have a certain training. Here, you've got not an army, and you've got drug cartels who kill without compunction with A-47s. Is that an enemy that requires a different style?
I mean, I think the reality of where the human rights movement is going is that different kinds of non-state actors require vastly different kinds of strategies. So if we pursue a kind of traditional legal approach to dealing with a problem like that, much the same way that when Facebook or Google make decisions which have vast implications for the human rights of hundreds of millions of people, we have to develop practice at how to influence those actors that looks fundamentally quite different to the way in which we might use a legal instrument to influence a government.
Well, there is a state actor that we could look at, and that's the United States, because this is a problem partly, isn't it, Anthony, of gun law, US gun laws, US immigration laws, US drug laws. I mean, you at the ACLU had great success in dealing with legally with the more cruel aspects of the Bush regime on Guantanamo, the war on terror. But isn't this, in one respect, a product of the US war on drugs?
You have a very good understanding of my personality. And so when I'm invited to a 75th anniversary party, I, of course, wake up in a very unromantic mood and think about not just the accomplishments of which we are all terribly proud, but also of our failings and our unwillingness to take on the responsibility for some of these issues. And frankly, the drug cartels are as much a creation of the illegality in the criminal mind as they are of the American government. The war on drugs is what has created the demand for drug cartels, because we fail to deal with the drug problem as a public health problem. We have criminalized it. We think about it as a war in the way which we think about other misguided wars. And frankly, my organization has believed and believes to this day that all drugs should be legal in America.
So I have a human right to consume heroin?
Absolutely. You're sovereign over your body. Mm-hmm. It could be regulated by the government. What you choose to put in your body, whether it's a glass of water or heroin, if regulated by the government, is your choice. Mm-hmm.
Is that a human right that Amnesty would stand for, Salil?
I think one of the criticisms of Amnesty has been that we are spreading ourselves too thin, so I better watch. Where we go.
Well, I don't know. 2/3 of the prisoners in America are there because of non-violent drug dealing. Would you call them prisoners of conscience?
No, I think, to go back to the question you started with, do we have, the basic freedoms in place? And I was just thinking about what's happening this week in this country with Troy Davis, whose fate is hanging in the balance, and we're calling it too much doubt. There's so much doubt, and this country is supposed to be the sort of great protector of civil rights, and here you have a case. And of course, this is also a country where you have an ex-president who's been boasting about authorizing waterboarding, which is internationally accepted as a form of torture. So I would say, Amnesty should stick to those issues.
Stick to those issues. Is there any role for Amnesty's techniques, traditional techniques of investigation and reporting in securing some sort of freedom from fear in Mexico?
We are at the center of we were just talking about the film which we collaborated on, Invisibles, and a lot of the sort of independent objective research which went into making the film, and the work that a lot of the human rights organizations in Mexico we partner with, but the research is one of our sort of core competencies. But the other thing, Jeffrey, which really, I saw Hossam Bhagat is here from Egypt, and since we're sitting right next to the UN building, we simply can't forget the fact that thousands of Syrians are being butchered as we speak here today. And if there's one thing that this meeting should not leave without recognizing, is that our friends in the building next door are not able to take action, and they're not able to call for Syria to be taken to the ICC simply because of the geopolitics involved.
Sure, but it was interesting that Anthony Romero, while his organization supports the right of individuals to take drugs, and that's a step too far for Amnesty. Your donations would diminish, I would imagine.
Actually, they increase from some areas.
Maybe increase from the cartel. Or not, because I suppose the object would be to end the cartels. But he puts it not on that necessarily human rights basis, not on that basis of the right to take drugs, but as a public health question, as it were a second-generation right of dealing with public health.
I must say that we don't choose our topics based on how our donations are going to flow. I mean, if you take the issue of full-faced veils in Islamic countries, we've campaigned for years against Saudi Arabia and Iran, countries which force women to wear full-faced veils. And now we're campaigning against governments in Belgium and France, etc., who are now denying the right to wear full-faced veils.
Well, I suppose the ACLU would probably support you on that.
Well, we also agree that women have a right to decide how they wish to dress in public.
Mm-hmm.
It's the right to personal autonomy and freedom.
And women have a right to abortion as a
Women have a right to
universal right,
abortion.
but that's something that Amnesty will not go that far, Celia.
No, I mean, on that issue, in terms of women's rights, sexual reproductive rights, the choices that they have to make, particularly in cases where it's going to affect their health and the health of the baby, I think we have a clear position.
Your position is that abortion should be decriminalized, and that
right.
cost you a lot of Catholic support. You were attacked by the Vatican, who said you were supporting violence against women, Cardinal Bertoni, but you nonetheless would not support abortion as a universal right.
No, but I mean, again, it's not based on the potential reaction of the Vatican. That's not the criteria.
What is it based on?
It's based on, because there is
Isn't abortion a universal right for women?
It is. I mean, we have to kind of balance the tension with the right to life. So that's where, we very much link it to basic women's rights and related to sexual reproductive rights.
Is it a basic women's right, Jackie?
Certainly. It certainly is. But if I can just get back to your initial question about fear and violence, I think one of the issues that is one of the frontiers for us going forward is the issue of inequality and how that drives violence. And in South Africa, you can very clearly see the link between inequality and extreme violence, particularly against women. And I think this is something that we haven't worked hard enough on. It is an absolutely critical issue, how to ensure that there is greater equality for men to be not disempowered so that they take out violence against women.
One of the interesting things about South Africa is that it's one of the few countries that has economic and social rights guaranteed in its constitution. And you've had a dozen or so groundbreaking cases that have been celebrated around the world where the court has upheld that. But have those cases done much for the victims?
I think what the socioeconomic rights jurisprudence in South Africa has shown is that ultimately socioeconomic rights perhaps has the biggest impact around accountability and governance. And this is where connection with social movements is absolutely essential, connecting the dots, the things we've been talking about, technology, linking up struggles, linking up information, linking people together to understand that where the government has particular obligations and is bound and has signed up to particular conventions or has a particular constitution, in effect, that it needs to be held accountable for that. And I think that that's where socioeconomic rights litigation in South Africa has been most powerful in terms of asserting itself as politics by different means.
We heard some of the opening voices, I think, from Juan Mendez, saying that the human rights movement has been dominated for a long time by lawyers. Is your experience in South Africa, for example, in the water litigation, you could perhaps tell us a little about, being that lawyers are not enough?
I think law is politics, and it's about power, and I think that when it's not about a parachute case, although I think that can be just as effective if you want to change legislation or policy, but essentially its great power is about giving people, changing the terms, shifting relationships, empowering people, and I think that there it is extremely powerful, and I think lawyers can play a very, very important role. Unfortunately, there are not enough public interest litigation lawyers in the world, I think, and certainly in South Africa.
Lawyers sufficient, necessary but not sufficient. In a sense, you need a movement.
Definitely it should be linked to social movements.
And was the success of your attempt to get the community access to clean water based on that movement theory rather than a peculiar legalistic?
In South Africa, we spent 5 years litigating the right to water. We won it in the High Court, we won it in the Supreme Court, and we ultimately lost in the Constitutional Court. But it was an extremely illuminating case because it was linked very specifically to community resistance, community action, and a huge social movement around the right to water. In fact, despite the fact that the order went against us, the politics shifted, and government was made aware that it couldn't ride roughshod over people to impose prepayment water meters unilaterally. And in fact, what the government did was withdrew and retreated from their primary position, even though the court case went in their favor.
So although you lost in court, you won in the wider political
That's
community. Right. How can your new technologies assist this kind of litigation-based but broader movement?
Well, before I say that, I should say that I grew up in Australia where I watched Geoffrey have his television program, Hypotheticals, having basically people quiver in fear at your incisive questioning. So it's good to be here. You guys have no idea what you're getting yourself into.
No, we don't. We did it, in fact.
But in answer to your question, I mean, I think we're in absolute agreement. I think the one challenge the human rights movement has faced is perhaps it's a little legalistic, and the theory of change that has driven the human rights movement traditionally. I mean, even when I grew up as an undergraduate, the most glamorous thing you could do was become an international human rights lawyer, and that was your pathway to social change. And I think a little bit of time on, we're now seeing that people can be extremely effective as kind of social entrepreneurs and what we would call movement entrepreneurs, who can make interventions beyond simply trying to change the international legal framework. Take the issue of LGBT rights. You can be as focused as you want on trying to shift some parameters at the UN on treatment of LGBT people. That's really not going to drive significant change quickly. And so you can pace the halls of the UN, or you can get out there in the global south and try to fight those battles. And I think on the issue of litigation there, you need to connect a litigation strategy, let's say on LGBT rights in a place, in places in sub-Saharan Africa, with preparing the ground with a social movement that can do the cultural and political change that is required to make a litigation strategy set up to succeed.
Harnessing the power of the powerless.
Exactly. And
if I could jump in, Geoffrey, I mean, one of the things that we all share at this sitting down, as opposed to those of us who are standing up, is the fact that there's much more kinship and experience as leaders of the human rights movement who are not just commenting on the social milieu or what's possible. We have to work on the ground. At the end of the day, we have to show results. And you may have a position that says, yes, all drugs should be legalized. We don't spend a huge amount of our efforts to try to legalize all drugs at this moment. It's a failed effort in America. We're trying to legalize marijuana in some jurisdictions, and that's even a failing effort. All of us have to be held responsible for taking what are limited resources and making a difference with it. And I think, therefore, the decisions that Amnesty makes and what it chooses to focus on, the very different cultural context in which it must work with, it has an infinitely more difficult job than I do for focusing on the US. I can always invoke one value, one legal tradition. Much more difficult when you're dealing with a very different cultural context. And the American experience is one that, frankly, we fail at many very important issues. It's not that we've got it right. South Africa. And my biggest frustration with my own organization and my sister organizations is that we are not dealing with the freedom from want very significantly.
Well, Amnesty did, in 2005, decide to embrace social and economic rights, and a number of your members were disquieted. They thought this would spread your work too thinly. How has it worked out over the last 5 years?
Frankly, coming from India, I think this distinction is, maybe the lawyers are a lot more clear as to what this distinction is than most ordinary people, because I understand there are two covenants, etc. I was asked recently when I started with Amnesty as to, because we are starting some of our work in India, and I see Ms. Narayan Murthy there, and the question that was asked to me is, so if you're going to start working in India, you're going to obviously focus on poverty, but what about all the torture that happens in police stations in India? So I asked this gentleman who's a leading light in the human rights world in the US, and I said, have you ever been to a police station in India? So he said, no. I said, none of me or my friends ever go to a police station in India, because we use private security and justice arrangements. Yeah. The people who are in police stations in India who are getting tortured are poor people. So the idea that, so we're talking about the rights of poor people, not, is it socio-economic, civil, political. it's a nice conversation to have, but I don't think it makes that much sense, frankly. So I mean, our members, I think, there's, the thing about Amnesty over the years, the reason why we've adapted and evolved is based on what our members are telling us. And as the membership in the Global South is growing, this conversation of saying we will only do civil political rights and not socioeconomic rights is not tenable. It's like saying we do men's rights and not women's rights.
Right. Exactly.
What does that mean? So,
One of your campaigns has been in relation to development aid and ensuring that human rights considerations are taken into account. How has that worked?
I mean, that's really kind of peripheral. The core campaigns have been around the right to adequate housing, the right to maternal health, and which are very interrelated questions. And development aid is only one part of it. I don't think Amnesty believes that development aid is going to be the solution. But when you have large international donors who are not making sure that the projects they're supporting are rights compliant, then we make a big push on that. And we've had many problems around big housing projects funded by big multilateral institutions, for example.
Mm-hmm. Diego, have you seen much result from Amnesty's focus on economic and social rights in Mexico? Could that assist the position in Mexico?
Not yet, but definitely there. An amazing feeling that is happening, and this is new. I mean, we're talking after 5 years of a war that has killed over 50,000 people, and it's a lot, So suddenly we have a much more politicized society. Young people have a point of view, and that's interesting. Gives us hope on a way. But we're really far away from really knowing where we live. We have an apparent democracy that we've been experiencing for a few years, and we were on an amazing ride of Valium for 70 years, and we had this government taking every decision for us, and we would just go with the flow, So it's quite interesting what's happening today, but we're far from succeeding in any of these aspects. At the end, it's all about social justice, and because of what's happening today and after September 11 and everything, all the violence happening around the world, every issue is seen from a security point of view, and that ruins everything, because we're never talking about people if we're talking about security. So I believe everything is about social justice, and we have to go, and that's, again, why I believe in film as a tool of change, because we go back to storytelling, to intimate and specific stories that suddenly can give you a whole idea of what's happening around the world, and also a connection, with a story in Mexico and then the story in Africa. Suddenly you realize you're not alone, and that your struggle is the struggle of someone else, and that gives you power.
And that realization that you're not alone is something that you feed off, Jeremy.
Yeah, I mean, I think what Diego describes happening in Mexico is something very exciting that we're seeing in the Global South, which is this increasing sense that people have agency in places where they haven't felt they've had any agency. And Mexico is an example where, even though you've had some kind of democracy in place, the civil society hasn't been very vibrant, and now we have tools that actually enable people to self-organize much more easily and create a sense of being powerful, even in places that have been very closed or very authoritarian. And so, I mean, this is very much what we're seeing. When we launched Avaz.org, several years ago, we weren't seeing this as much, but now you see, India, Brazil, the emerging middle classes of those countries spontaneously organizing in the millions around issues in their own countries. And the process of doing that is incredibly motivating to those people, and it unlocks something much more quickly and much more easily than you could unlock before.
Jeremy, just one thing which Jeremy mentioned, which I want to sort of defer on, which is connected with the Mexico question, because I work with the UN, and anybody who's had much to do with the UN would be very nervous about spending too much time, in those corridors. So I mean, the skepticism is well placed. But at the same time, the fact is that there are things which the UN can do, which nobody else can do. I mean, there might be sort of various groups, G8, G20, etc., which might be very powerful economically, but they don't have the legitimacy which comes with the UN. But if you take the issue of the criminal gangs in Mexico and the drug cartels, etc., core issues about how to regulate arms trade, particularly the sale of arms, weapons to to regimes and to non-state actors who are absolutely violating human rights, committing human rights abuses. So the Arms Trade Treaty, for example, which is now at an advanced stage of discussion, which is coming up next year at the UN, is really crucial. And I think that's something where, while we may have sort of allergies to the UN, that's a space where you have to engage and you have to make that happen. Now, as we've heard before, it doesn't mean that if you have a treaty, it gets implemented. But it's very important to have the treaty. That is an important starting point.
I think
So let me echo that and show a bit of my romantic side, because I think that the human rights movement at its best is like a helicopter. It lands on the ground, firmly rooted in a context, firmly on the ground, dealing with the situation on the ground. And the best of our movement over the last 75 years has been able then to elevate itself and take a different view from a higher perch. And when I think of social and economic rights, in my community of domestic civil rights organizations, because social and economic rights are not justiciable in the courts the way that civil rights and political rights are, we've often given it short shrift. And through the help of some great colleagues like John Powell in the room, we've been able to think afresh about placing a social and economic rights lens on our civil and political rights. So I say to my colleagues at the ACLU, if our docket looks exactly the same way it did 4 years ago, in the middle of the Great Recession, where the greatest shift of economic opportunities happened in America, where poorer are poorer and the richer are richer, and the income has dropped and assets have dropped for the people we care most about, if our docket looks exactly the same with the same cases and clients, we're missing the boat. And so we place an economic and social rights lens through the work of John Powell, one of our great thinkers. And we began then to think about how do we deal with the foreclosure crisis in Florida. We don't do housing. We do due process. We do civil procedure. When they set up a new foreclosure court in Florida that cuts corners, undoes all the established rules of civil procedure, where people who lose their homes are not given the notice and consent, the ability to intervene, are bypassed out of the civil court system into a foreclosure court system they've created to make it easy to take away people's homes without proper due process, we file that case. It's a due process case. It's a civil procedure case. We do it because we're trying to achieve social and economic rights. And we benefit from being able to hear our South African colleagues pull us up off the ground and say, well, economic and social rights are not justiciable in America. But you pull us up, and we land again, and we have a very different strategy as a result of that effort. And that's where our community does brilliantly. And I don't think many other communities do it as well as we do in terms of thinking about the practicality of making something work and thinking about the vision of the aspiration of what should be achievable.
Is that a practical way, Jackie, of making social and economic rights a reality?
Absolutely. I think it's a very strategic thing. You use what you can in the context where you are. You read the context, you use whatever instruments you can, you use the alliances. In South Africa as well, we find that often administrative law and equality are stronger ways to get at something than the socioeconomic rights itself. But essentially we use what we can, where we can, and exactly as you've been talking about, it's a strategic intervention.
Even in countries like India and South Africa, where it is justiciable, I mean, that doesn't mean that there's going to be justice. So
that's right, and
we
I think
have
there's
another bunch of issues around, right to information, access to justice, and I'm certainly saying in the amnesty context that, just like you said, using a socioeconomic lens to all your civil political rights work. I'm also saying the converse, that let's use a sort of civil political rights lens to look at how you make socioeconomic rights real for ordinary people.
Yeah, I think it's a false dichotomy. I really do think there isn't really so much of a distinction anymore. And
criminal justice is our, I'm sorry, Jackie, to interrupt you. Criminal justice is our top priority. We've been working on it for decades. We've had the leading docket about the conditions of confinement in prisons. Now with this new economic difficulty and the rise of the Tea Party, we have begun to say the best way to fix the economic deficits of the states and having smaller government is to depopulate these prisons. And I write an inaugural blog for the Tea Party, inviting them to tea, telling me that if you really care about smaller government and shrinking the deficit, boy, do we have a solution for you. And a lot of our friends sometimes in the civil rights, human rights community say, you're giving up the ghost, Anthony. You're not talking about racial justice anymore. You're talking about the economics of depopulating the prisons. To which I say, well, the reason why we work on prisons is not because I'm trying to fix the deficit. I know nothing about the Eurozone, so I don't opine on that. But I care about prisons because of the social justice lens. And I don't care what moves the ball forward. If an economic argument is what makes us work for a goal and a value that we've established, I'm glad to sublimate some of those values in the context of making progress. And I think that's that kind of that pivoting that's so critical in our work that sometimes gets misunderstood.
And I think that the issue of race comes out there very much as well, which is something we don't often talk about.
Absolutely.
But in the US and in South Africa, of course, there is a complete correlation between race and class. And this is something that we need to bring out much more, the racialization of poverty, of exclusion.
Let's move on and look. You heard Ken Roth talk about his vision in 50 years' time that all states would honor human rights. But perhaps states aren't entirely enough, and we ought to look at focusing to some extent on non-state actors. You recently had a success against the British state. Could we just examine that for a moment? Tell us about it, the Uganda case.
Well, sure. I mean, it was a case launched by All Out, the global gay rights group that we started. It was actually how we started the organization, in a very specific way. There was a woman, a Ugandan lesbian, who was about to be deported back to Uganda from the UK. The UK is actually a pretty unfriendly policy toward asylum seekers, and it's a broader problem for LGBT asylum seekers, where they're not believed. This woman was not believed that she was a lesbian, and so the judge didn't think she read lesbian, and so she was about to be deported. So we had 4 days, and this is an example of the sort of new organizing models. We had 4 days to stop the deportation, and it was a way to create international attention around the case. And the fact that there was this sense of urgency and focus created a huge international groundswell. So we had literally tens of thousands of people in a matter of hours write to Theresa May, the UK Home Secretary, and then all of these other more traditional factors kicked in. So, Amnesty and other groups got involved, provided the fact base and the legitimacy that added huge weight to that effort. The mainstream media got involved, and then, of course, we were able to have conversations with the Home Secretary and other folks in the United Kingdom that shifted the result. Literally, she was on the plane. We were all having a very nervous Friday. She was pulled off the plane before the deportation.
So after
occurred.
law failed,
Yeah.
your mass mobilization of world opinion worked.
And, but the point here, I think, is speed really does matter in this new environment. So the fact that we were able to mobilize people so quickly was critical. And so if we'd waited a while, or if we'd just issued a press release or used the traditional armory of tactics, I don't think she would have been pulled off that
But it worked on the British government. How are you working on Uganda, and particularly the Anglican bishops in Uganda who support even the death penalty for gays?
Well, the way we're doing that actually is through the American evangelicals who are funding and supporting those bishops. And so there is a very direct line between people in the United States funded by, I might add, the people who are associated with mainstream Republican presidential candidates.
Absolutely.
And this hate. And so there are very effective levers when you can mobilize international public opinion. These guys are vulnerable because these US evangelicals have connections to mainstream Republicans who want to be elected president, and those people are directly funding efforts that support not just the criminalization of homosexuality, but in fact turning it into something that is subject to execution. And so, that's a very useful lever. So international pressure is not always the way you do it, and there are sometimes where you have to work very hard on the ground with human rights activists there in parallel, but that can be very effective, and by scaring those evangelicals and sending a message to the people who support them, we can drive changes on the ground in places like Uganda.
We mentioned previously the abortion problem. Is it easy for human rights, particularly organizations which are broadly funded, to take on religious dogmas that are demonizing gays and lesbians?
I was, some of you may have seen the 50th anniversary documentary which BBC did recently, and it has a clip in which I was sitting with David Kato, who was murdered shortly after that filming. And the situation in Uganda, LGBT issues is vicious. There's no question about it. And I think, there could be some short-term fixes like going through the American evangelicals, etc. But I think the only way in which these issues can be dealt with is by having, these societies and these countries need to have the very serious internal conversations. And so the human rights education work, which Amnesty has done for decades in schools and colleges, it doesn't have a short-term payoff, but it's absolutely essential. And Amnesty is just about to start significant scaling up of our work in sub-Saharan Africa and Brazil and India. I was in India for the last 2 weeks, and we just need to start having serious discussions as to what do human rights mean in these countries, these emerging economies, or even a place like Uganda, as to, because there's, on the one hand, we're talking about global leadership on many issues, but when it comes to these questions, you asked about abortion. So Indonesia was a classic example. There are 20,000 women dying every year in Indonesia. Maternal mortality, women dying during childbirth, pregnancy, and Indonesia is a big champion of the Millennium Development Goals. And at the same time, they're not ready to legalize abortion. So this kind of people don't connect the two pieces, and they say it's Islamic. So we have to get the Islamic leaders to have a very public conversation on this question. There's no shortcut.
And just to Salil's point, which I agree with, I think one of the highest value things we can do is make groups on the ground in Uganda, like the LGBT groups who are really weak, really underfunded, and who don't have these tools and know how to use them. So I think one of the highest leverage things we can do is not just campaign on their behalf, but to actually, by campaigning with them on issues, as we've been doing in Uganda, alongside them actually doing a transfer of essentially of knowledge and skills and, to your point, human rights education. So these guys can take these tools and run with them. And that's what we're seeing. But there's a huge need to scale up the sophistication of this work, not just the ability to do some of the elite work, but also to do the kind of organizing work that builds long-term power.
But are you ever going to tackle the fundamental problem of the religious dogma in Brazil, Jackie? The Catholic Church has put pressure on politicians, and they've passed a law that requires doctors in hospitals to report to the police whenever a woman comes in bleeding from an attempted termination. And there are over 100 women waiting trial, prosecuted for the crime of abortion. This is a country where, of course, the Catholic Church protects its priests who rape small children, because they don't report them to the police, they report injured women. Is this a problem that can be satisfied by these roundabout ways, or do you have to actually take on the church?
I think it's not either or. I think it's all of the above. And I think that it's extremely important, particularly if we get back to the issue of LGBTI. I think it's very important for countries in the global south to stand up to, for example, in Africa, for South African LGBTI communities to stand up and try to knock away at this myth that, for example, being lesbian or gay is not an African thing. I think these sorts of campaigns are extremely important. The higher level escalation is important. It's important, the church, the mobilization within church groups, it's all important. It's not either or.
But I would take on the church, Diego, in your filmmaking. You know, out of Mexico came the story of Father Maciel Delgado, the monster priest who raped his own children and hundreds of others in the seminaries that he set up, and was blessed by John Paul II in the knowledge of what he'd done.
It tells you a lot about the country. I mean, you're talking about a country that used to give the most amount of money a year to the Vatican. Then again, all these rich families would invest so much in the organization of Father Maciel, paying tons of money to send their kids there in order to give them the chance to have the leadership of Mr. Maciel. Then there was this amazing thing that happened every year. Just the chosen ones would go to the Vatican with him, without the parents, obviously, and 15, 20 kids would travel and meet John Paul II. So obviously we go back to fear and impunity. The structure, the institution of the church is probably the strongest one, the most powerful one in our country.
But no one's made a film about that case.
We are working on that. Yeah, definitely.
I mean, it's just the factual side of it. I was talking to some of the senior most policymakers, ministers who are handling health policy, etc. in Indonesia. They actually are not aware of the fact that there's almost 1 million abortions taking place, because the law they have is meant to deter and prevent abortion. But 1 million women are going through abortions every year, Indonesian women. And that could be your sister, your cousin. And that's how Kasha speaks. Unfortunately, she's not here today, in relation to the LGBT issue in Uganda, that, your sister could be a lesbian. So, I mean, you start making it very personal, that it could happen in your own house. So you can't stigmatize, people because it's somebody else, it's fine, but it could be one of your own people. So.
But ACLU, Tony, has always, ever since the Scopes monkey trial, has been prepared to take on religious dogmas.
And we just sued the Catholics recently in Kansas, which my mother stopped talking to me for a week.
But is it time
altar
that
boy turns litigator against the Catholic Church?
for the human rights lobby to get off the fence and
But look,
say hell is contrary to the Torture Convention, let's actually take on the religious dogmas?
And I think one of the difficult parts for the human rights community is finding the allies where you have them, in government or within
They've been very helpful on the death penalty, the Catholic
or within
Church.
established religions. Not all religious leaders are enemies of human rights. And we have very great, excellent government officials who now serve our government with Tony West and Harold Coe and others we'll hear from. But I think in the human rights community, we have to also remind ourselves that even when you have the greatest of allies in these institutions, we also understand that the governments have to be the targets. And that our role is not to placate or to downplay or to work with and be co-opted by governments. Our role is to hold their feet to the fire. And we irk our friends terribly when we criticize the Obama administration for having very similar policies to that of George Bush on the war on terror. We irritate the hell out of our colleagues when we say in places where the religious leadership is very established, when we sue the religious leadership. And yet I think that what's important is to understand that the solution is not going to come from, and perhaps this is a byproduct of our success. Human rights has become so ubiquitous. It's such a part of the kind of the modern realpolitik. So we think about human rights in government and human rights with international NGOs. It's on the ground work. It's the country-based work rooted in that context that's going to hold those governments' feet to the fire.
Do you agree with that, Jackie, or is it?
100%. I think it's absolutely essential to build the movements on the ground in the country. I think
Without alienating potential allies like the churches?
No, I think you can alienate. Sometimes you have to. Sometimes you have to be aggressive. But you have to read every situation, decide strategically whether it's worth alienating. But I would agree as well that there are certain campaigns and issues where it is extremely useful to have recourse to international frameworks, international groupings, to pin your campaign onto something like that. But I think ultimately it's going to depend on what happens in the country.
See, what I find remarkable is that the ACLU has been working against the religious right for the last 25, 30 years. So we work on Focus on the Family Research Council. We had a meeting recently with our domestic civil rights and human rights organizations, domestic human rights groups, just like the ACLU in different contexts, independent, defend the rights of all citizens, and work on this through litigation, campaigning, and public education. There wasn't an international NGO anywhere in the room because it was just us chickens, different sized chickens, but we're all chickens. We all work in our own country context. When they asked questions of each other and of us, saying, well, who is the Family Research Council that's showing up in Argentina, pushing their ignorance? Well, we've been fighting the Family Research Council in the US for 20 some odd years. And we have a certain ability to say, well, let me send you my message points. Their talking points are exactly the same. The Family Research Council and all these other kind of domestic US anti-choice, anti-gay rights groups have opened up offices in Argentina, in South Africa, in Kenya. They've gone global. And yet what's global is the international human rights community, which is essential. But the domestic human rights groups, which do hand-to-hand combat on the ground every day against these forces, are yet not connected up the way that we need to be effective across the globe. And that's the piece I think needs to come in.
I think we need more mechanisms for transnational campaigning.
Absolutely.
And LGBT rights are a great example. It's an issue around which, if you feel that issue, it's not like you couldn't do a transnational campaign in support of healthcare reform in the United States. But you can do a transnational campaign in favor of this because people all over the world, you could get a trans person in Brazil identifying with and acting on behalf of their brother or sister in Uganda. And there's something very powerful in that because the identity that gets created through that transnational campaigning is important. So in parallel, we need the structures in place because human rights are such transnational issues to have organizations that are nimble and can do the kind of transnational campaigning that we do.
Let me bring you in.
Like yours.
I was just going to say, we focus quite a lot when you talked about non-state actors on the religious groups, but one of the groups that many of us here are looking at are also transnational corporations.
Of course.
And Amnesty is particularly focused on the extractive industry. And I just want to make sure we don't miss that, and that's a very challenging conversation.
Well, that's the other non-state actor that I wanted you to look at, namely, what about the multinational corporations, particularly in the mining industries? And it goes back to Nuremberg, the failure to put Krupp on the main trial, and the failure of certain countries to actually have a law against corporate manslaughter led to somehow corporations disappeared from the international justice radar. They're not capable of being prosecuted in the International Criminal Court. There is no convention, and this is perhaps one convention that we do need. There's no convention that makes corporations liable for deceit, for destroying cultural heritage, for consumer crookery. There was a suggestion in 2003 of a new convention that I think Amnesty supported, and John Bolton ensured was defeated. He said it would be passed over his dead body, and he wanted voluntary self-regulation through the Global Compact. Does that work at all in your
that's the
experience?
sort of Ruggie principles as well, which have come out now, and we have, of course, we fully understand the role that economic corporations play in economic development, etc. So that's not the issue. The difficulty we've had is, you take what's come out in Niger Delta right now, because we've been working on the Shell issue for a while in Nigeria, and the recent UNEP report which has come out has now independently established that there's been massive environmental damage and damage to people's livelihoods and lives in that area. And the issue really is that a lot of the corporations who are involved in extractives particularly don't feel that there are any consequences that they have to face. And the voluntary stuff is great. The problem with the voluntary stuff is that it's always the good guys who, they're going to be doing the right thing anyway. The problem we have is with the ones who are not going to be doing the right things. And that's when you need mandatory standards. And then of course the argument is, how do you do that? It's too complicated. Everything is very complicated when you start. And Sir Vernon Ellis, who you know from the UK, was telling me the story about health safety issues. He's the chair of the Royal National Opera, or the English National Opera, and apparently they had this big argument about how do you make sure that the stage is safe for artists, etc. And there's a big debate initially, and initially all of that was considered to be voluntary. Health and safety was considered voluntary. Today it's compulsory, and it's normal. So initially everything sounds really awful. So.
Yeah, the Rupert Murdoch's in the dock at the moment over the telephone hacking, which a voluntary self-regulation has done nothing to stop.
And if we think that it's hard bringing cases against governments, God help us when we actually take on these cases against corporate entities.
Well, there may be some possibilities here, Jeremy, with the WikiLeaks developments. You now have, for example, Julian Assange with his material on Swiss banks and tax avoidance. Is that a way forward? Perhaps not a particularly lawful way forward, but hacking into corporations to reveal their secrets.
Well, I think this is actually an area for some optimism, which is that I think we're seeing that the new kinds of movement building that are emerging are very effective at changing corporate behavior. I think governments are kind of inured to organized pressure because that's what they do, whereas these corporations can be quite easily and quite significantly rattled. I think it gets more challenging for extractive industries deep into the supply chain. But there are ways to reach them through the more consumer-facing companies that engage with them and are then at risk. So I think there's a lot of growth and a lot of potential for much more systematically going after those corporations, companies like Monsanto who are doing huge damage to the world, and just shining a huge light and mobilizing a lot of people and attention. I think there are a whole bunch of other tactics. Shareholder activism, I think, is very
WikiLeaks
promising.
hacking into their, getting their secrets. Is that?
I think it's.
Come on, is that
Plead the fifth.
I think it's plead the fifth.
You have the right to remain silent.
Exactly. I think when it's legal, it's justifiable.
But I think
I'm amazed at the hostility in America to Julian Assange. I mean, Biden and Huckabee all talk about treating him as a terrorist. When I act for him, I've got more death threats for acting for him from America than ever, but they mainly come on emails. So
It's good politics
I
in
tend to
America.
ignore them. But what is I mean, Sarah Palin says, hunt him down like Bin Laden. Whenever I go to see him in Norfolk, you keep a wary eye out for Navy SEALs. But what is the cause of this? I mean, freedom of information is a peculiarly American.
And I've gotten myself into a row within my organization on this issue. I think there are parts of what Assange released to the public which were important for the public debate. I also believe that government has a right to have private conversations on policies and issues that don't always have to be released to the public. There are leaders of the human rights community that have been put in peril, put in harm's way as a result of their names and their conversations with the State Department.
Isn't it the duty of the State Department to protect them by not allowing them to be seen by several million people, including 22-year-old soldiers?
Well, and I think part of the difficulty is that obviously the duty to protect is hard for them to assure it completely. And I think we can't just let Assange off in saying that when you publish the names of the human rights leaders in Afghanistan who now can be targeted by some of the rebels or these non-state actors, which are not only NGOs or social movements, it's also terrorist cells, that we put them in harm's way. Going back to corporations, I think the difficulty for us at the ACLU is thinking through how to scale up on issues around corporate malfeasance. We recently sued, in our first ever case, this company, biotech company, Myriad, because it holds the patents to 2 genes that are essential in the formation of breast cancer. So every time you want to have a test, if you have a genetic predisposition for breast cancer, you have to pay a higher fee than you do in Europe on the royalties. If oncologists are doing research on it, they have to pay royalties to this company. They own things that are in nature. We've never brought this case. It was a battle royale about whether or not we should bring this case. Would we undo the patent system that is essential to the formation of freedom of thought and freedom of science? Or do we believe that what is in nature cannot be owned by a corporation? When we took the case, I love this case. Breast cancer has touched every family, immigrant, citizen, wealthy, poor, black, white, Republican, Democrat. It's the first case my mother, who's a survivor of breast cancer, really believed that the ACLU was doing something for her. She said, I don't care about the guys in the orange jumpsuits. This case is actually doing something for us. But all holy hell breaks loose from the biotech industry. And you should see the phone calls I got from donors, from investors, from people who are not even donors, who thought that they could get me on the phone and chew me out. I'm like, well, when you send me the check, I'll be glad to spend time with you. Right now, I have other things on my agenda. But when you take on something like corporations, which you get out of the comfort zone, it really requires a different set of strategies, a different ability, and that's what funders can do, is to give us the ability to think through these issues and the independence from the market, which will always boomerang on us if we take on the right issues.
That's a challenge ahead. Finally, let's look at what the Ford Foundation calls one of its programs, Democracy, Rights and Justice. Churchill called democracy the worst form of government ever devised, except for all the others. But is it time, do you think, Salil, for amnesty, for example, to get off the fence? It's always been traditionally very careful not to approve of one political system or another. But isn't the message of the Arab Spring that democracy is a human right?
I think the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights already sort of, specifically talks about democracy sort of as a core element. But I think the difficulty I have is when we equate democracy with elections. And I come from a country which has had a long tradition of elections, and the last 2 months has been a massive anti-corruption agitation in India. Just to remind our leaders that just because they're elected, that doesn't make them unaccountable. So the issue of accountability, the issue of the institutions, the independent judiciary, the core media freedoms, which together make democracy. Amnesty would be fully behind it. But if you say that just because you have an election, we are sitting in a country which has elections as well. with some difficulty sometimes. But so if you say, sign off on elections equals human rights, that would be a problem.
But there are 40 countries left in the world that are effective dictatorships, real dictatorships, whether they're monarchies or military juntas or whatever. What's your view, Jeremy? Should we accept now democracy as a necessary, if not sufficient, condition for human rights and declare full-bloodedly that democracy is a human right?
I mean, I think we just need a more fully fleshed out conception of democracy. I was in China this week, and the former Singaporean Prime Minister said, our version of democracy is a 1 1/4 party system, where the quarter party, he said this, I kid you not, makes suggestions to the governing party. And so, that's clearly not democracy.
Well, that's Lee Kuan Yew's version of democracy, which of course is a fraud. But are we not committed to work against it, Jackie? What's your view on this? I mean, as Professor Sen says, no democracy suffers famine.
I think I couldn't agree more with Salil. It's a question of what we're talking about democracy. It's quite clear that having regular elections and particular frameworks are extremely important, but then the real work begins. And I think that all of the issues such as moving away from identity politics, moving to accountability, moving to responsibility, moving to participation, consultation are extremely important. And I do believe very strongly that moving towards equality and away from inequality is a part of that.
And corporate power, I think, I was just going to say, you can't have democracy, you can't have a fully fleshed out conception of democracy if the role of corporate power is not addressed. And I think that the situation here in the US is indicative of that. And so I think that's very much our obligation as advocates.
Amnesty's
as well.
position is, we look at the human rights impact of the government, not about whether, you can't use democracy as an excuse to abuse human rights. So, it works both ways.
But I think our biggest challenge is also talking with governments who are often complicit in these 40 countries who are totalitarian or dictatorships. I was fortunate enough to be part of a group of these domestic human rights organizations when we set up a meeting with the Secretary of State. And I was thrilled to see Hassan Bhagat argue with Secretary Clinton that she shouldn't give up the ghost on Egypt. There was apparently a bit of fatigue on Egypt. And Hassan told her, please don't give up the fact that this may look like a stable ally, but it's not a stable democracy. And it's not as entrenched as you think. And you could just see her face soften. I'm speaking out of school, but it's not your fault, Hassan. I'm not going to get you in trouble. And then 3 weeks later, you see the Arab Spring. And I hear from an email from one of our colleagues in the State Department saying, thank God Hassan had it right and we had it wrong. And I think a part of the time you have to work with the governments who are often entrenched in thinking through stability equals good.
Well, he may be a son of a bitch, but at least he's our son of a bitch, has been a State Department mantra for many years. There are far fewer sons of bitches, but they're still around. Tell me, Diego, should democracy, Mexico style, be a human right? Has it done much for you?
The thing is, democracy has to come with education and information and, again, equality. And we live in a country that doesn't understand what equality and justice is. So today, you cannot call that a democracy. I mean, we have elections. Yeah, we do. And we spend a lot of money in elections also. And there is a big business around it. But it has nothing to do with human rights, It's all about the business.
And I think you're going to see increasing assertiveness by countries like China, and many of these Asian countries who've grown very successfully and lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty without democracy. And they're becoming much more assertive about their own political models. And that's going to be a very interesting challenge to kind of liberal Democrats, because they're going to be able to say, with some legitimacy, well, through our stable model of economic development and without the kind of paralysis and disruption of multi-party politics, we've produced extraordinary human rights and economic development outcomes for our people, and that's a challenge.
That's what Ben Ali said for years.
On that note, we must end this conversation about Roosevelt's third and fourth freedoms. I mean, when you talk to concentration camp survivors, they all say what mattered to us in the camps was not our deprivation of liberty, It was the aching and all-pervading hunger that we felt. And it's the war on want that the human rights movement must embrace. It will be accused by Samuel Moyn and other Harvard Brahmins of being utopian and wasting its talents by looking broader. But in fact, I think what we've seen, what has emerged from this discussion, is that human rights, strictly so-called, the civil and political rights, are an important but nonetheless not exhaustive part, and that we're all part of the movement for global justice. So thank you all to our panelists. We'll progress on.